What is up, guys? Welcome back to another GeekaWhat video, and today I can't believe it's 2020 already, and to celebrate I'm bringing back the budget builds. I'm going to be putting together, showing you how it's done and running you through all the parts for a great value $400 gaming PC build. So without any further ado, make sure to get subscribed, but let's get straight into it. Now, a couple of you may have noticed the new home studio setup. If you like it, let me know in the comments. And if you want to see like a home studio tour video, make sure to smash that like button. But let's start the build off with our motherboard and our CPU. This CPU here is brand new from AMD, and it's their Ryzen 3400G, their new top of the range APU chip that combines a GPU and a CPU into one unit. And at this price point, it's the best option that you're going to find. Now, this is actually so brand new that I haven't opened it yet since it got delivered from Amazon. I have got some scissors. As I was saying, I haven't actually opened this yet, so I'm probably just as excited as you are. In the box, there's a couple of things we're going to need. First is our processor, and secondly is the included stock cooler, which comes with thermal paste pre-applied, which is going to make the next stage really easy. Talking of the processor, this chip has a base clock speed of 3.7 GHz, with a boost clock speed up to 4.2 GHz, which should give you some really great single-threaded performance. We're going to be installing our CPU into the motherboard. This here is the MSI B450 Pro VDH Max. Now, that's quite a long-winded, boring name, but the Max bit is the really important bit, because that means it's got the BIOS update required for these third generation Ryzen CPUs. Installing our CPU is easy. Find the golden triangle on your CPU, align it with the triangle on your socket, and because this is AMD, you don't need any force whatsoever. You can see it's dropped in, give it a bit of a wiggle, and just like that, it's installed no problem at all. The next thing you need to do is take the backplate that comes included with your motherboard, and this is what's going to basically clamp our CPU cooler to the motherboard. All we then need to do is take our included stock cooler with the pre-applied thermal paste, line the screws up with those on the backplate, and simply screw it in. Try and do it kind of corner by corner. It can be a bit loud to avoid damaging our CPU. And then just like that, plug it into the fan header on the top of the motherboard, and it's pretty much ready to go. Now, the next component that we're going to pop in is our RAM, our memory, and this is the final thing to install before we move our motherboard assembly into the case. Now, when you're building a system with an APU, there are one or two things that you do need to keep in mind. The first of those is that you want your memory to be dual channel, which means you need 2 sticks and ideally 4 RAM DIMMs on your motherboard. The second thing you need is for quite a bit of memory, because you don't have the dedicated graphics memory you normally have. And the final thing is that the memory needs to be pretty quick. So this 16GB kit of 3000 MHz RGB memory from Teamgroup is going to work perfectly. Installing RAM's really easy. Simply pull back the retention clips on your RAM DIMMs and line the notch on the memory with the notch on your motherboard. Once you've got the two lined up, apply even pressure to both sides of your memory DIMM, and that's really all there is to it. Repeat for as many DIMMs as you've got, and just like that, it literally could not be easier. Now that brings me on quite nicely to our case, and we're of course going to pop our motherboard into the case. This is the Aerocool Shard, and it's a budget-oriented ATX mid-tower case that's actually pretty compact. The first thing you want to do with any case is unscrew the side panel. Now, this isn't a tempered glass side panel, it is acrylic, but that is something you're going to find on cheaper cases. And an acrylic panel is better than no panel at all by a long stretch. Now this case for the price is really nicely designed. It's got a power supply shield which hides our nasty power supply away, a good bit of RGB here at the front that's going to look great when it's powered on, and just about enough ventilation as well on the side and the bottom to keep our temperatures at a reasonable level. Inside the case you'll find this, which is the bag of included screws and accessories, which will help you screw your motherboard into place. Before we do that though, you want to take your motherboard's rear I/O shield and install this, because if you forget to do it now, you're going to have a headache later on. With our I/O shield finally installed, that was actually quite difficult, we need to line up the motherboard with that rear I/O shield and check if all the necessary standoffs are installed. And if not, install all the necessary standoffs under each of the holes on our motherboard. With all the standoffs installed, what I'm actually going to do now is install our power supply just before our motherboard, because this is going to make cable management in this particular chassis a bit easier. This is an 80 plus certified 500 watt unit from Thermaltake that costs around about $44, which is an absolute bargain. You don't want to go too cheap on the power supply, but in a system like this, as long as it's from a reputable manufacturer, Thermaltake included, you're going to be fine. Okay then, with our motherboard installed and our CPU power plugged in, as you'll have seen there, hence why I put the power supply in first, all that's left to do is to plug up our motherboard power cable and then some of our front panel headers along the bottom of the motherboard. Now then, with pretty much all our components installed and plugged in and wired up, all that's left to go is our storage. I actually went for a singular SSD in this build. Normally I'd go for a hard drive in a kind of budget build like this, but they're just so slow and SSDs now are getting cheaper and cheaper. This is a more budget oriented drive and it's the Sandisk SSD Plus, though it's still going to be at least twice as quick as the fastest available kind of mainstream hard drive solution. In order to install our SSD, all you need is a SATA power cable, which will come included in your motherboard's box. Plug this into your motherboard and then spin the case around, plugging the other end into your SSD. Once our SSD is nice and securely plugged in, we need a SATA power connector, which just plugs in like so. Now you could go to a great effort to securely mount this, but because it's completely solid state, there's no moving parts, you can actually just kind of and pop it down here with all the cables nicely tucked away. Now I know it seems a bit mental that I'm just placing an SSD here. Because it's solid state, it's got no moving parts, you haven't got to worry about it. And now then it seems all that's left to do is plug up a SATA power cable for our front RGB here, do a bit of cable management, whack those side panels on and see just how well this system performs. But first, it's montage time, because just how good does this thing look when it's all powered up and turned on?
Summer's calling.
A massive shout out to NordVPN for sponsoring today's video. Securing your internet access can be as cheap as a single cup of coffee a month. With over 5,000 servers in 60 countries, NordVPN has you covered. What's more, their servers are recommended by Speedtest, yes, that Speedtest, and even work in countries like China and the UAE. Want to watch UK Netflix shows in the US and vice versa? Of course you do. NordVPN has you covered. With double data encryption for increased anonymity and no data login whatsoever, it's super secure. And if you're feeling really cool, you can even pay for it with Bitcoin. They also take PayPal and all major credit cards. Head to nordvpn.org/GeekaWhat and use coupon code GeekaWhat for a 3-year plan with the first month absolutely free. Secure your internet access today, not tomorrow, today, with unlimited bandwidth at nordvpn.org/GeekaWhat. Now that you've seen how this system's put together and just how good it looks when it's all powered up, we're going to look at some gaming performance so that if you build this system, you know exactly what you can expect. I started off with Project Cars 2, start not too difficult, a nice and easy title to run, but also not a particularly old game as well, if that makes sense. I was seeing here kind of a 35 to 40 FPS average, which for a first-person shooter game wouldn't be particularly good, but for a racing game, that's the kind of frame rates you'll see on consoles. You don't need the 60 FPS for when you're racing around a racetrack, to put it bluntly. As the race progressed and kind of the system got more familiar with the scenery, and I'll come on to that more in a minute, the frame rate did rise, and I was seeing 45 to 46, 47 FPS quite a lot of the time. The next title on my hit list today is Fortnite. Here I was seeing an average of 65 frames per second, and once again, like Project Cars 2, the FPS got better as we went on. Coming off the battle bus as it first rendered in all that scenery, the frame rate definitely was dropping quite a bit lower, kind of the 48 to 52 mark, which is still pretty good for a machine like this at 1080p Full HD medium settings. A couple of years ago, APUs couldn't even run 720p in the modern titles. Once it had stabilised though, we were seeing 65 to 85 frames per second. This does have a tendency to dip up and down quite dramatically, but for the most part, very, very impressive stuff. CSGO is another game where this system and the APU itself really impressed. And quite literally, that APU is made for CSGO. Those esportsy kind of titles are where it flourishes, and here I was seeing the highest FPS of well over 100 frames per second, which is crazy. That's like high refresh rate monitor kind of stuff. For the most part though, 88 frames per second give or take average is where we were sitting most of the time, which is not at all to be complained at. I was impressed by the overall brightness of the scene and how things looked pretty sharp on 1080p medium settings. The game though, of all of them I was most impressed with was actually Overwatch. Overwatch looked incredible. Maybe it's because it has the fun kind of fictional graphics, but it looked honestly as good as some of the systems from a distance, not up close obviously, that I've done and gamed at 4K with, and you can see for yourself just how good it looks. Frame rate was a little bit shaky, but for the most part, 55 to 60 frames per second is where it was pretty much sitting all of the time. The final game on my list today is Forza Horizon 4. Now, I did use the suggested preset. All of this was at 1080p Full HD for every game. I think 720p is not an enjoyable experience, and with the suggested preset of low, in inverted commas, we were looking around 45 frames per second, which for a racing game like Project Cars 2 that I talked about a little moment ago is actually more than acceptable. You do lose a little bit of detail with the low fidelity settings where things get a little bit more fuzzy around the edges, they're not quite as sharp, but nevertheless it's a very playable experience. And you've got to remember, you can pick up a $100 graphics card in a year, 2 years time, pop it in this machine and get some incredible gaming performance while changing none of the other components. If all you've got to spend is $400, which that was kind of how much I spent on my first PC, $450 I think I spent, then this is definitely a system that you're going to be impressed with. It's a case you've got to sort of realise you're not going to be playing the latest AAA titles, the likes of Call of Duty, and getting 60 FPS at 1080p, high settings, obviously. But if you can manage expectations, and your kind of game library is more focused towards those esportsy style games, Fortnite, Apex, CSGO, Overwatch, then this system is going to suit you perfectly. That though I think pretty much wraps it up for today's video. If you did enjoy it, give it a big old like rating and make sure to get subscribed. Check out today's video sponsor and all the parts I mentioned for latest pricing in the description down below. But thank you very much for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next GeekaWhat video.